I am Dr. Andrea Kita, and I am speaking today with a very honored guest. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm Professor Anand Prahlad. At the moment, I'm a professor emeritus because I retired recently.
Yes.
I've been working for 30 years at the University of Missouri in Columbia.
Wonderful. And you're a poet and a musician and an author and a folklorist, and it seems like you do a little bit of everything.
Well, not everything, but a lot of things.
Well, I really appreciate it. I've been dying to talk to you ever since probably the first time I saw you speak at the American Folklore Society. I was at a panel on disability, and I heard you speaking there. And I have to say, one of my favorite parts about when you speak is that you give us a list of actionable items. And I love that. I think that's just wonderful, because I think there's so many times in academia we just talk about things and we don't do anything. And you always give us a list, and I love that. So I really appreciate that. Please continue to do that, because I love that list.
Oh. I will.
So, and the most recently, of course, at this year's AFS, which was entirely online, you spoke about sort of the idea that folklore studies and a lot of the basis of our field is really based in racism and is based in colonialism, and that our first experiences in what we would call our discipline are really just are completely, people going into other places and exoticizing others, and usually during an act of colonialism. And that was, it's one of those things that but at the same time, it's always good to hear it repeated back, I think, to hear people talk about it. And one of the things that really, really struck me that you said, I was rewatching the video. I was so glad we had those videos to rewatch. One of the things you said was that folklore studies, not only began with colonialism, but folk is as close as anyone can get to a slur without being one. And that really just hit me. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, from which point of view? The folklorist's point of view, or the point of view of people who are outside the discipline?
Honestly, both. I would love to hear both.
Okay. So if you're not a folklorist and you hear people say the folk, you automatically assume things like archaic, backwards, ignorant, primitive, exotic, weird. And there's some actual basis for why people might think that way, because from the very beginning, those people who were collecting folklore, what we call folklore now, and writing about it, had those ideas about the people that they were collecting and writing about. So at some point in time, and I'm not sure, it might have been maybe the 60s or 70s in folklore studies, when people began to sort of push back against that notion that folk inherently means people who are primitive. And you might remember the Dundee's article where he talks about American folklore, the groups that American folklorists mainly have studied, immigrants, Black people, Indians, and I forget if there was another group in there. And that article, I think, came out in the 60s, maybe 70s. And then moving into the 70s, we get people challenging the idea that folklore is a rural phenomenon, and writing about people in urban areas and kinds of folklore that might not have been considered under the rubric before that. but we didn't continue pushing against it in the 80s or in the 90s or the 2000s. So we kind of got to that point in the 70s when there was the pushback, and we sort of stopped. So I love what we study. I love being a part of the field of folklore, but I don't like the word folklore because being African American, I've culturally been the object of that exoticizing that I'm talking about and writing about. And so for me, that's just problematic. So one of the things I was going to do, because you mentioned I give list, I'm actually in some of my work that I'm doing now, trying to suggest alternatives to folklore to this term. So I honestly haven't come up with anything that I would say, oh, I'm going to put that out there because this is a good alternative. But I'm continuing to do it because it's a real question. Well, if we're not going to say folk, if we're not going to say folklore, what are we going to say to sort of encompass the kind of materials that we're concerned with? Does that answer that?
Yeah, it does. It kind of reminds me too, because I've in the back of my head, I've been planning this article that I'm going to write eventually, or actually more of just a short piece, embracing the term lore, just as just the lore, because that's what so many of my students call it. And it's in part because of video games and television shows where they refer to the lore. And they drop folk out of it entirely, but they have this knowledge of the term lore as exactly what we would call folklore. And I think that's so interesting that it's like they're picking it up not necessarily because of understanding colonialism or those things. They're picking it up more for pop culture. But I think it's a term we shouldn't reject, at least. And that was, my sort of idea was that I was going to call, like, let's embrace it as a term, because it does drop the folk of it, which has always been problematic. And it just has that lore, which, if we look at the English language, that goes back to a word that just means knowledge. And I kind of like that idea, but I don't know if it'll ever catch on. But I think you found another really great reason for us to maybe think about a different term. And I know that's been a part of our history too, is let's call it something else. And we've really struggled with that as a discipline. But for a lot of different reasons.
I had kind of run through some options, get rid of folk, get rid of lore, and I came across at one point meta lore. And then from that, I kind of went in a different direction to ask myself, is the materials we call folklore, are they inherently meta lore? Or are there just certain instances in which it's meta lore? And that led me to doing research on the term meta. So I ended up sort of going down the rabbit hole, more researching meta and never really getting back to that question of, but it's something that I'm really interested in. To what extent are people who are using folklore aware or reflective of the fact they're using folklore?
Yeah.
Are they ever not aware?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I always teach, when I teach my graduate students, I always teach Jay Meckling's article, "You Can't Teach Folklore." And in part because I disagree with him, that I think that some of our students are, he refers to as a sort of double consciousness, where you know you're in the middle of folklore while you're actively involved in it. And he kind of says that, you know, people either get it or they don't. And I've had a lot of conversations with other folklorists about, especially our students and the ones who get it or don't. And so many of our students who get it automatically are students that have to move between two worlds. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that understand inherently, they're sort of, you know, a kind of natural folklorists because they've grown up in this environment where they've had to live in two worlds. So they very much understand what they're performing and how that shift happens. And it's so interesting to see that because, you know, obviously, I think you can teach folklore. That would be, you know, I think we can teach that that double consciousness or whatever you want to call it. But it comes more naturally to some people. And I don't want to say naturally as in that's a good thing, because it's not a good thing that these the students who normally get it are students that have to move between worlds, because a lot of times the worlds they have to move between aren't good. They aren't, you know, they're not in positive landscapes. They're you know, well, someone like me, and I see this in my own students because I work and teach in North Carolina. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and a lot of my students are Appalachian, and as am I. And so that a lot of them have that double consciousness between Appalachian and, you know, sort of regular white life, or, you know, whatever the sort of standard that they've been taught against. And a lot of them go between those two worlds, and they have a lot of anxiety about it, and they have a lot of other things. And I can see that too with my African American students, with my students that are from different countries. They're constantly shifting between worlds, and yeah, there's something really interesting in that. But again, it's not always good, and that's, you know, something else that you brought up in your talk is that folklore isn't always good. It's, you know, we talk so much about celebration. When that's not all folklore is. It can be really negative things as well. Mm-hmm. So one other thing I was thinking about when you were in the Utley lecture, you kind of talked about that there's very little written about white folk, especially historically. And that was something I was really thinking about, because there's something in there that as you know, as a folklorist, I don't want to overemphasize white voices, because I feel like they're already dominant in culture and society. But I also don't want to exoticize people, you know, while I'm trying to give them a voice. And do you think there's a way to find a balance in there?
Well, to go back to what I was saying in the lecture, it's not just that folklorists have chosen to write primarily about non-white people. It's also that they've chosen to write without acknowledging their whiteness. So in some ways, that's almost more the issue than whether they've chosen to write about primarily people of color. And writing without acknowledging one's whiteness is to, let's say, reinforce the notion that whiteness is a norm, or whiteness equals an objective point of view, or the notion that the whiteness and the white point of view doesn't need to be interrogated or explained. So in many ways, that's more the issue. So I would say if that part of the equation was addressed, it would matter less who people chose to write about. But at the same time, to get back to your question, if if you chose to write it, let's say you come from a family where your parents are professors, or they're doctors, or they're airline pilots, or they're attorneys, and you choose to write about one of those subcultures, I don't think you would have an impulse to exoticize them because they would be a norm for you. And that's also a big part of what I'm suggesting is that a lot of folklorists have chosen to write about that which is not a norm for them. And if you write about something that's not a norm, then it's more easy to exoticize it because in some ways it is exotic to you. So, for example, if I chose to write about many aspects or folk groups within white culture, they would be exotic to me because they would be unfamiliar and strange. And I would think, wow, I've never seen anyone do that, or I've never known that people say that, those kind of reactions. So a big part of what I was suggesting is that we not only tend to write about people of color, but we've tended to write about people of lower social standing and economic means. So if a folklorist goes to, let's say they come from a middle-class family and they go to Appalachia, they might be writing, they may be white and they might be writing about a group of white people, but there's a good chance that some degree of exoticizing those people is going to take place. So that part of the equation that I really am sort of wanting to emphasize is, why does it have to be people from lower socioeconomic classes that we're writing about? And that's sort of buys into that idea of who is the folk? Why can't the folk really be anybody? Why do we have to even go anywhere to study a group? Because wherever we are, whoever we are, all around us, there's folk groups.
Yeah. It's so interesting too, because it really does fit into the framework of how we're supposed to be the detached observer as well. And I mean, that's something we've all been taught. And well, and even I went from an undergrad in history to folklore, and that seemed radically different at the time because I was allowed to use I in a sentence, you know, and that seemed like such a big deal to me. But even now, we still try to detach ourselves instead of, you know, we have terms like participant observation and those things, but we're still supposed to speak in that detached observer way. And, you know, I always go back to Ruth Bahar's vulnerable observer with that and think about, you know, how she talked about how she has a whole, I can't remember the exact quote, but she talks about how you're supposed to, you know, just pack up your stuff and go home at the end of field work and pretend like none of this bothered you, and you're supposed to write objectively. And it's just so interesting to think about why we have that, as like, why is objective the best way to approach this? And you're sometimes encouraged not to study your own group. You're told, you know, don't do family folklore, don't do the folklore of your own group because you won't be objective enough. It's like, well, why is objectivity the you know, why is that the goal?
Well, I think that goes back to the colonial origin of our field as well. The age of enlightenment in Europe, when, let's say, science began to be more of a valued discourse, and the intelligentsia, I'll put it that way, promoted this idea that being objective was a big important part of being scientific. And this is what we needed to do, be rational and scientific and not guided or persuaded by our baser instincts and so forth and so on. And that sort of remained a big part of the way we approach things in academia, which includes and folklore. But a question that comes to my mind, and I think this is a big part of the issue, why are we doing the folklore study to begin with? What is the purpose? Who are we doing it for? Because who does it serve to completely detach, or at least pretend that we're detaching ourselves and being objectives? Whose agenda does that serve? It doesn't serve the agendas of the people that we're working with, for sure. I would argue that it doesn't serve our own personal agendas if a part of our agendas is self-growth. It serves the interests and agendas of an academy that insist on a certain kind of discourse in order to promote us and, let's say, consider our work to be valid and worthy. So it's an institutional mandate.
It is.
That we assume these kind of perspectives and personas, but I don't think it's in our own best interest as human beings on this planet. I don't think it's in the best interest of people that we might be working with. So, and I can say these things now that I've retired.
That's so true, because it's, so much of our work has to be guided by things like, we have to get jobs, we have to get tenure, we have to, there's all these hoops to jump through, and only certain types of research are allowed in those spaces. And it's so frustrating, because even with all the problems that folklore has as it is, it's still hard to meet those goals as a folklorist, because people don't realize how much time it takes to do good ethical field work. And, so it really doesn't fit into that interaction that we hopefully have with the people we speak to, where it's a relationship and we give back to them. And it's not just about taking things and being objective. It's, it's more about, hopefully more about establishing relationships, helping people find their own voices. I think that's one of the sort of more like ultimate goals of folklore. One of our most idealistic ideas is that we help people who don't have a voice have a voice. And, that's, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. And that's, that is not something, and I think most folklorists would say that's one of my goals, but that's not something that fits into the goal of academia or the goal of a lot of other things.
No, it's not. After my second book, the book on reggae, I stopped doing academic field work in ethnography. And it was often a topic we talked about in my ethnography seminars, because my students needed to do ethnographic projects. And we always talked about the ethics of doing ethnography and the issues and power differentials between ourselves and people we might be working with, and all of those sorts of things. But I was always in the situation where I would have to talk about my own perspective on ethnography, which was a little bit awkward, assigning ethnographic projects, but not doing it myself. But I became very close to some of the people in Jamaica that I worked with. And after I published the book, I had some correspondence with some of them, and I just wasn't able to reconcile um, a lot of things about it didn't feel right to me. I had gone there, I'd done the field work, of course, I did all the research, and I wrote the book, and I got all of the credit. Mm-hmm. And the people that I worked with there in Jamaica, they were experiencing difficult times. They were poor people who were just doing whatever they could do to make ends meet. One of the people that I remember, I met him and I told him what I was working on, and he said, well, why don't you come and stay with me? Because I can take you around and I can show you reggae venues and so forth. This was in Kingston. And so I went home with him, and he lived in a really small shack that was made of corrugated metal. And inside he had room for a bed and a little table with a hot plate, and pretty much that was it. And the bathroom was kind of hole in the ground outside, and the shower was a kind of public shower there in that, among that group of other really small sort of shacks in that area. And he was so gracious. I mean, he gave me, his dinner was Vienna sausages and a slice of bread, which he offered to me. And he did take me places, and he let me sleep in his bed while he kind of slept in a chair. I had quite a few experiences like that in Jamaica. So when I got back, I thought, what can I do to help them? And for all practical purposes, I couldn't do anything to help them. I mean, I didn't have resources to do anything to help them, but I just, after that, I couldn't do ethnography anymore. And I've continued to interview people, but I never turn it into an ethnographic project. Rather, it in some way goes into my creative writing, or my music, or something like that, but not into ethnography. Yeah. So I don't have the answer really to the question. I only have the question: how do we really do ethical ethnography and do work that we can feel good about, and at the same time meet the expectations of our departments and our campus and college tenure committees and the provosts and the president when they review our tenure files? That question I just don't have an answer to.
I know. I wish I had a better answer as well. It is. It's so difficult because you're torn, I think, in a lot of ways between what is ethical, what is right, and what we need to do in order to be considered, objective and an academic and, a good folklorist. It's so difficult. How do we do that? And I think in some ways we just need to redefine all of these things. And, it's so hard though, because especially university systems move so slowly. They don't change. And this is something I've struggled with even within my own, among my own colleagues, is saying things like, if you have two people working together on a project, you don't give 50% of the credit to each person. That's not how collaborative research works. There's all these things that I'm trying to get people to think a little bit more forwardly about. And they just, and if you can't get them to even agree to that, then how do you get them to agree to maybe that the end goal isn't, the single authored book, as maybe there are other things that should qualify. And especially, this was one thing I've argued too in the past, is things that involve the community should qualify for as research. And because you do research in order to get these things together, you do field work, you work with the community, rising them up as the experts in their own culture is academic work. It's very frustrating. That's what I'm trying to get at. I don't have a great solution to that either. And I appreciate that AFS has tried to talk about that and tried to be different, but there's still so much more to do. There's so much more that we need to do.
There is. And as I was listening to you talk, it occurred to me, institutions really converse with institutions. And institutions respect the points of view of other institutions, not so much the point of view of individuals within the institution. So I think one of the challenges that we have is creating institutions that in some way validates that kind of research that you were mentioning. And so far, we don't have a lot of those. One could say the Smithsonian would be such an institution. But the problem with that is the Smithsonian doesn't necessarily, a lot of the work that people who do at the Smithsonian doesn't have any like publication expectation or requirement attached to it. And in fact, unfortunately, a lot of academic folklorists it's kind of look down on some of the work that people at the Smithsonian might be doing. So,
yeah, it is. And I think those become, because of white supremacy and other institutions like that, there are people that can't see outside of them still, and that they don't see that they're influenced by them. And yeah, it's one of those things where I sometimes wonder, can we change and save these institutions, or do we need to just tear them down entirely and start all over again? And start when we're not from a base of white supremacy and colonialism, and I don't know the answer to that either.
Well, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So,
yeah.
So I think having flawed institutions or having a flawed relationship with institutions might be better than having no institutions at all.
Yeah.
or not having any relationships at all, because at least that's a place to begin.
Hmm.
If you tear the house down, and let's say you're living in a turbulent climate,
Hmm.
then a lot of things could go wrong in trying to build a new house.
Very true. Yeah.
And I mean, I think we're in a pretty turbulent
Yes.
right now. So I'm not sure if this would be a good time to tear houses down.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah. So, what do you think there are ways that we can con- conduct a different type of ethnography? Is there ways that we can change what we do that I don't know, redesign the house without tearing it down? I guess maybe that's a good metaphor. I'm not sure.
Well, I think
Hmm.
it would be productive to have more conversations about what it is we want to accomplish, and if a part of what we desire is to empower communities or empower individuals within in communities, then to take that as a starting place for the conversations about how we can change our ethnography. Um, a part of that is what has led me to stop writing academic work and to write more creative work, because one of the projects that I'm working on is it's kind of a community memoir focused on the the plantation black plantation community where I grew up.
Hmm.
Um, I I didn't grow up, and I didn't have the awareness until recently that this is kind of a unusual experience to grow up in an area where the black people who live there are from descendants of people from that plantation which still exist. Um, and I've heard stories about my ancestors going back to slavery on that plantation, and I continue to gather those stories from my mother and older people. So whatever this work is going to be, it'll be a creative work that gives them voices,
Hmm.
and that uh, in giving them voices address certain racial and disability issues.
Hmm.
But I couldn't do that writing an academic book. Um, and so I just kind of had to let that part of it go, and look more to writing poetically. Um, so that's been my solution. But if I were an assistant professor and I was writing this book, I don't know that it would get me tenure,
Hmm.
as if it were sent out to reviewers, it would have to be reviewers in creative writing. um,
Yeah.
if it were sent out, and this is a part of what also I was really pressing in my talk. If an assistant professor writes a book like that, they're coming up for tenure, and they're putting together a list of possible reviewers.
Mm.
And then the committee puts together a list of possible reviewers. A lot of those reviewers will be folklorists.
Mm.
Would folklorists write positively about that book?
Yeah.
Or would they write things like, I didn't cite certain people for this particular point? Or you know what I'm getting at?
Absolutely. Yes.
So in a way, that's kind of a double bind.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're a folklorist and you're in the academy, when it comes time for tenure and promotion, other folklorists are going to be people who are doing a lot of the external review material.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Would they accept? And I remember even when I was a student, like coming up with ideas and having mentors tell me, no, that's the book you write later. That's the book after tenure. That's not the book now. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay, you know, and I got that very early on, that there was only certain types of research are going to get you tenure. Only for certain types of research are quote unquote acceptable. And I even remember when my first book came out, I had written it because I wanted other people than folklorists to read it. I wanted it to be useful, honestly, useful for a lot of different people. And I remember a folklorist saying to me when I said that, "Oh, so it's not a real folklore book." And I was just like, "No, it's absolutely a real folklore book." The fact that I didn't write it in a style that only is accessible to people in academia doesn't make it less folklore. It makes it more usable. It makes it, you know, something that other people can read and understand. And I think you can have real folklore research in a book that is with a different type of ethnography, or a different type, or that is written for a general audience, or that doesn't, you know, it doesn't use gatekeeping in a lot of different ways, in all the ways that academia does use gatekeeping. And I find that ultimately frustrating, especially when you write something that the people you studied couldn't understand. That really bothers me. That idea of putting together
Yes.
something like that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a rough thing. I think we're going to have to keep working on. And yeah, there's yeah, that's a lot of what I wanted to talk to you about today. And I also just wanted to say too, we didn't really get to talk about disability studies as much, but I read your memoir, The Secret Life of a Black Aspie, and I loved it so much. I thought it was just such a wonderfully written book that, to me, isn't just a memoir. It is a type of ethnography. It is talking about, you know, the ethnographic, and that's a group we have not studied, isn't it? It's a group we certainly haven't looked at. But you write it in this way too, that obviously we are very different people. We look very different. We have very different experiences. But you wrote it in this way that made it, I could identify with so much of what you wrote. Which was so interesting, because I'm not on the autism spectrum. I have attention deficit disorder, but the way, like, you wrote about color is the way that I feel about texture.
Mm-hmm.
And there is like so much there that I thought, well, he's such a good writer that even though we are totally different people and we have totally different experiences and I have different privilege, and that I could so identify with what you were saying, what you were writing, that I was just like, wow, he is such a good writer.
You
Just
know,
such a wonderful book.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I did intend it to be also a folklore book.
Yes, it
Right?
is. That's what I thought.
And I also had the sense of I was writing for not just a Black person on the spectrum, but neurodivergent people.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like that resonated with you as well. So that really makes me feel good. That
It was,
that
yeah.
um, I was talking to my mom about it the other day, because she said she was reading some parts and she was having trouble with them. Translation, um, they were emotionally difficult for her. But she said, I can tell you another time what some of those parts are. And she went on to talk about one of them. And when she talked about it, it wasn't really anything that had to do with me at all,
Mm-hmm.
which relieved me a little bit. But as I was talking to her, I thought, I can't believe that I wrote all of that personal.
And it is. It's so personal, but I appreciate it so much. It's, yeah, as someone that's neurodivergent, I was just like, oh my gosh, we don't have the same experience or the same condition or any of those things, but I appreciated that so much. And like even the ending where you're talking about, what food goes with the color of the couch and I was like, oh gosh, that sounds so familiar, in this totally different way. But yeah, and I actually I started because you divide up periods of your life by like when you lived in the yellow house or the with this color kind of talk, and I started like now I have actually, because of that, I've started mentally thinking about texture, because that's mine is, and I was like, oh, that was the velvet time, that was the and I actually started like mentally referring to that, because I would talk about it in sort of not to use a disparaging term, but normie terms. I would say, oh, it was when I lived here, or like the descriptions I'm supposed to use, but not the descriptions that I have in me, right? And I was like, oh, that is, yeah, that's it just really kind of freed me to think of it in those terms, which I would love. That was so great to be able to do that and to think about that, and it also kind of helped me process too why I feel more comfortable in certain places than I do in other ones. And I was like, oh, it's those things. I and it was something I didn't recognize until I read your book, and I was like, oh, that's it's such a beautiful book. I'm actually planning on using it when I teach disability studies, and I'd like to use it actually as an ethnography text too, because I think it is a type of beautiful ethnography that that really does, like, I don't want to say help people understand, because I don't think that's always the goal. I think it is in part to show people that there's a different world out there that they're not a part of. And I, especially as a belief scholar too, love the way that you talked about ghosts and how you talked about your experiences. And I just adored all of that. I think I told you when we spoke setting this up that it quickly turned into a book I was reading academically it slid into my pleasure reading hours of the day.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I have two things. One, that book was kind of my coming out. And so since writing it, I can talk that way to people rather than, as you put it, using like normie and talking to people. Not just talk that way, but insist on that being a valid way to talk about things. And then the second thing that occurred to me, I'm working on an article now on sort of autism, disability studies, autism and race. And when I get done, I'm working on it for a talk. So it's not all together, but I think you would enjoy reading it.
I think I definitely would. Actually, I'm going to keep reading everything that you write, because you're just a great writer. And I remember when you were even speaking, I was so glad that the Utley lecture was recorded, because I was frantically taking notes and I couldn't keep up. I was like, because you would say something and then I'd have a thought and then I'd get lost in my thought, and then you were still speaking and I'm like, oh no, I have to keep taking notes. I can't have thoughts right now. And yeah, that's kind of the beauty of having everything online now and doing recordings even like this, where people can rewatch it. And for people like me, at least, that's such a gift, because it means you can say something, I can hit pause, I can have all my thoughts and feelings and write all my things, and then I can hit play again, right? And I can have my reaction to it, which I really appreciate and love, and didn't realize it was something that was missing in my life until then. So yeah, well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really, really appreciate it. This was, honestly, I was just so excited to talk to you, because I felt like reading that book, I felt like I knew you a little bit. And even though we've only met like once, I think, and it just, yeah, it was exciting because it was for me like talking to somebody I already knew, even though we don't really know each other that well.
Well, I really I appreciate you asking me to do this,
Yeah.
and I'm glad that I was able to do it. And I really look forward to having more conversations with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.